Melinda, thank you. The brave ones got out on the ice today and came to church, didn't they? So that's the first thing. Uh, well, as you might remember, I don't make a big issue out of it, but we're sort of doing a series that concerns the mechanics of the universe. In other words, the spiritual universe, how things work. And it's been always my belief for many, many years that that was what Jesus was teaching. And that he was showing us ideas, and I think it gets interpreted as like being holy or righteous, using those kind of words, but it's really just how to make everything work to the maximum good for what you experience here while you're on the planet. And this is how I interpret, and this is the idea that I'm following, is that more or less you could say the keys to the kingdom are the mechanics of the universe. But this title is Knock and the Door Will Open. Well, before I get started on that, I heard a wonderful joke that I have to share with you, and I guess you'll be the judge of that, how good it is. But it seems that there was a man that was shipwrecked, and he spent 30 years on a desert island. And then after 30 years, there was a ship that came by and noticed that there were signs of life and activity, and so it docked, and they came to pick this man up that had spent 30 years by himself. And the rescuer came ashore and looked up and said, "Hey," he said, "Guy," he said, "did you build those wonderful structures, those 3 wonderful structures up there on the hill?" And he said, "Yes." And he said, "Well, you're quite a craftsman." He said, "What are they?" And he said, "Well, the middle one up there is the house I live in." And he said, "The structure over here is the church I go to." And so the guy said, "Well, what is that one over there?" And he said, "Oh, that's the church I used to go to." There's a scripture, and this doors are mentioned so many times, and always in the context of a door being the passageway to something better, to opportunity, to spirituality. There's all sorts of things, but it's really symbolic. And I don't know whether a metaphor would be exactly right, but symbolic, I think, is a good thing. But it's trying to paint a picture of that passageway and those instances in the journey of our life here on this planet that we come to. And what then is the idea that gets us through the right and correct doors and keeps us on the right path? See, now that's basically, but the scripture says, "Knock and the door will open." Well, here's the whole verse, and it's from Matthew 7, and it's the 7th verse and a little piece of the 8th. "Ask, and it will be given to you. Seek, and you will find. Knock, and the door will be open to you." And then at the last part of the 8th verse, it says, "For everyone who knocks, the door will open." It's like an absolute. Do any of you remember anything about plane geometry? And does the word axiom mean anything to you? Remember that? It's something that you could count on, and it's right all the time. Now, sometimes you may get it wrong or get the wrong answer to the problem, but the axioms that were laid out when we started in geometry, it's just like something that never variables. There's a scripture in James that said, with God, there are no variables. And this is what it's talking about, that there are some things that are absolute. Well, so it's an axiom. I remember an experience I had, this is a long time ago, like 1966, And I was a construction superintendent and sort of a young one and didn't really have enough experience to do the job that a company had sent me to do, which was, if you've ever been to the Civic Center in Denton, it's a big, looks like a round building. Actually, it's a polygon, which is a 40-sided figure. Well, I remember the day that I showed up there. I had I had the blueprints under my arm. They were just getting our office shack set up. And a civil engineer from the city of Denton came out, and he had a helper, and the helper was helping him work on the transit, and they put a nail in a tree, big nail, and they said, now there is your benchmark. Said, don't lose this. Don't cut this tree down. Don't cut this limb off. You can depend that now is the level of your foundation. And every dimension that you'll see on the plan that's vertical comes off of that one dimension. And then he had us pour, I had a helper myself, and we poured a pier, like a pier, only it was in a sonotube. And he put a great big old nail, like you would drive through a railroad tie, but he put it down in there, and he said, now that is the center of everything. Now we're out on just a vacant piece of land. And so when he got through saying that, he said, now don't lose this either. He said, keep it. And he said, I put the nail in. They checked it again to make sure that this was the height of the floor, that it would still be there when, we got the foundation poured. You could just leave it in the sonotube the way it was situated. Okay. Now, he got in his car with his helper, and I never saw him again. But I had the nail, and I had the sonotube, and the center point. And he said, well, that's all you'll need, that in your blueprint, which more wisdom was really what I needed. But even though there were many days I decided that I was over my head, I kept on going, and those reference points never failed. It was just like the same thing about an axiom of life. Well, it's my belief that when we find something that Jesus made, and it's an absolute statement like this, he's saying, now, if you knock, and he's referring to anything in searching spiritually, or really any opportunity as applied to life. It doesn't have to be, because it could have to do with a job. It could have to do with just nearly anything. But if you are searching, you're knocking on that door, and he says it in an absolute, he doesn't say, well, there's some good chance, or like a 80-20 chance that this door will open. He didn't say that, did he? Absolutely. And so I've always, or not always, but I have recently begun to take this as one of the axioms of life, because it is from the scripture, and it occurs several different times. But here it is. Here is the idea that here is something that I can count on, like a benchmark or like an absolute point of reference, to where I know that when I reach that point of decision, that I can knock on this spiritual door and it will open. Absolutely, it will open. So there's some things about this that I want to really try to make clear, because in the midst of all of these teachings, Jesus made one other little point, and that's seeking first the kingdom of heaven. And everything else in the physical or material world is there available and just flows into you. Everything that you'll ever need, if you do that first. So really, in a way, it's the seeker of spiritual good that we can say this axiom applies in this form of life. If we're not seeking, I'm not sure what to say about it. I'll just leave that up to you to decide, because there were times in my life that it appeared that I wasn't seeking the right thing. I found a lot of other things, but they weren't the things that actually made a difference in my life and brought me upward rather than downward. So faith then is a beginning point, and learning to trust Learning to trust, to have faith. For example, in a premise, an axiom or premise is not a truth until you make it your truth and have faith in it. In other words, we can waver in consciousness about these things, and it really doesn't feel the same. But when we say this is an absolute in my life, I know that this is what is working for me, that's called having faith in it. There's another story about a door, and there's lots of different opinions about this. I'm not going to go into all of them. I did this week go back and read all of the various opinions about the expression that Jesus used when he was referring to the rich. And to make it short, it was like it's difficult for the rich, like it would be for a camel to pass through the eye of a needle. Now, lots of different interpretations on that, but one of them, and the one that I like, is the one that mentions that there is a door or a gate that people use after dark, that there's the huge gates that open to the city. And Jerusalem is the city, of course, we're talking about, and that usually represents, like going up to Jerusalem, has to do with spirituality in the symbols of it. But in this case, it was the reality that there really is a Jerusalem, and that at night the gates, the big gates of the city close, but then for emergencies there's a little narrow gate that's called the eye of the needle. Now this is, like I said, I don't know whether this has ever been authentic or not, or this, scholars debate this. Okay, but I like the idea because they say that the gate is so narrow that if you have a lot of stuff loaded onto your camel or whatever you're coming through with, that you have to unload it. You have to get that off because it won't go through the eye of the needle. And that's where it got its name. And I thought, do you know what? This is just sort of a symbol of how we are. I think that we're born and come into the world free of all of the possible baggage that could be, and that the design that you have enables you to go through the eye of the needle. In other words, to pass into that area of spirituality. And then now, as we go along through life, we begin to collect baggage. Now, you can't get the baggage through this narrow gate, can you? I mean, do you see the correlation there? The idea being that even though we are born and designed in such a way to get through that gate and to have that opportunity and to be able to knock on any door, spiritual, physical, otherwise, and it will be open. This is what we're born with. And then it's frequently, I'm using myself as the example of how hard I tried to clutter up everything to where there was so much baggage that you couldn't really get through that gate. So that is the idea, that when we leave the hurts and the pains and all of the negative events, all of the things, I think that we can say for sure that guilt, for example, doesn't enable us to get better. It seems like it bogs us down, and I know that it's not used as much anymore from the pulpit as it once was. I can remember the day that it was all about that and getting everybody to feel guilty so that we would have a lot of people walking down the aisles, you see. All of these things that you're not doing. I can remember that no matter how good you thought you had been or how many of the commandments, but if you weren't out winning souls every day, you just didn't qualify for really being righteous, you know. I can remember that issue. Now then, another thought that I have, that it is through our belief then that the door will open. Now, making it, once again, making it our truth. But our job, when we begin to look at it, we say, okay, what is Spirit's job in all of this, and what is our job? One of the things that's really important is to know that being specific when we express the desires of our heart. We had a class, and in prosperity. And so I asked the question to begin with in this class: what is the priority that you have? And what, when you come out of the ideas of this class, of what you really want most of all, the top issue for nearly everybody, I can't remember an exception right offhand, but was to grow spiritually. That was prosperity to them, you see. Well, do you know that when I look at it, I'm thinking that it's not like it's all about materialism, but yet it includes that, because we have to have the food to eat, we have to have a place to stay, we have to have all of these things, and I don't really feel like that I've ever seen anything that indicates that we are limited in resources, that we live in an attitude of spiritual abundance, but in that spiritual abundance, it includes absolutely everything. So then our job is to express, whether it's spiritual growth, whether we want to have a deeper spiritual experience, whether there is a portion of materialism that doesn't seem to show up, because in spirituality, you have the power within you to manifest. This is part of it. And it doesn't mean necessarily, like I said, things, because I think sometimes we get more things than we know what to do with, and we have places to store. And so as a result, then, what we're looking to is some expanded experience in our spiritual world. Well, the idea then is to be very definite about what it is that we are expressing as the desire of our heart. Whatever in life, and being very specific, because I have seen this work over and over. So now that's our job. That's part of our job. Now what then is Spirit's part? Spirit is to open the door. Now, there's one other thing that's our part. The door can be opened, but we have to walk through. We have to do the walking through. Do you remember the little story? I can't even think of the name of it now, but it was the Andy Griffin Show or something. Or he was the sheriff and Barney was it. And they arrested people, and there was a drunk. I can't even think of his name now. There you go. You got. What a memory! What a memory! But he discovered one day that that they didn't lock the doors. I think they'd lost the key or something or other. And really, in a way, in a sense, that's how our life is. We don't really know that door is so available to us. It's because sometimes, especially if we're all bogged down in concerns for our physical world, well then, we don't realize that a great opportunity is there before us. And then, like I said, it can be material, it can be a job, whatever. One of the things on this very subject that I really wanted to comment on is I went to an event Friday night, and it had to do with a little religion and a little politics. I was surprised. I mean, I didn't really know what to expect. I had been invited over there, and I was at a table of people that were sort of new thought, and one or two of them walked out because of something said, that didn't fit what we deeply believe in. And but anyway, I thought, well, this can't be a wasted evening. But before we left, a young lady that was there at the table said, I want to tell you something. Said, don't get away without me telling you this. And she said, I came to Harmony one day, and you made a statement that somebody, that if you're unemployed, and she said, I was unemployed, and you stated that somebody out there is desperately looking for who you are and what you do and what you're all about. And she said, would you believe a job showed up and they had a list of qualifications, and every one of the qualifications met what I do the best. So, you know, when I left there, and I'm thinking about this message too, I've got it sort of buzzing in my head, and I'm thinking, do you know, I believe that's an axiom of truth if we embrace it. And that was the expression. She said, when I embraced that idea, the job showed up. Well, if you would not believe how many people have come to me and said, this really led me into the exact job that I wanted for my life. And that is such a thrill. And I thought I would drive at night, no matter how much sleep I'd had the night before or how tired I was, just for that one thing. None of the rest of it meant that much, but just for hearing that one thing, because that was so encouraging. And then I got thinking about it, the nature of the work that I did back for many years after I left the Southern Baptist ministry. I was a superintendent for a while, and then in 1969 I went into business for myself. And sometimes you had a job that only lasted 2 or 3 months. And often at that time you couldn't see that far ahead. And you could be unemployed in 3 or 4 weeks. But the idea that I discovered that if you just stay in there and you're doing your very best at whatever it is you're doing, you're just doing your best, and you're trying to, whatever the customer is or whatever organization you're a part of or whatever it is you're doing, if you're just giving the best that you have and taking the best possible attitude that you can for it, then it appears that there's just always something that keeps following that. Well, with this happening, and in about 50 years later, I said, you know, this must be an axiom of life. Maybe not 50 years, but too long before I really decided that and that's when I began teaching it. Because I said, if you embrace a truth, then it becomes your truth, and it's like that creative force that we have within us that actually develops it. Now, let's think of another point of view here in this. To actually do the best we can, there is a word, and I'm not really sure this is the right word, but there's a scripture, and in it, this is what I see in the thing. Is if we take a determined approach to whatever it is we're doing, a determined, or maybe the better word is focused. If we really are focused on what it is that we want to experience next, well then, you can guarantee the door will open. There's a story, and it's about someone. I'll just read it to you. I wrote all this down just in case I had time to read it. All right. Jesus said to them, suppose you have a friend, and you go to him at midnight and say, friend, lend me 3 loaves of bread. A friend of mine on a journey has come to me, and I have no food to offer him. And suppose the one inside answers, don't bother me. The door is already locked. My children are already in bed. I can't get up and give you anything. Then Jesus said, I tell you, even though he will not get up and give him because he is a friend, because, and there is a word used in the King James, because of his importunity. Do you remember that word? I don't hear that used a lot. It's not used again in the Bible anywhere. It was in the dictionary, but I don't remember any of you ever using importunity. But here a newer translation begins to say boldness. And so I looked up the importunity, and it was like being irritating to the point of whatever it was, not resisting anymore. Well, I think that's what that story, in other words, it has to be a sincerity there. It has to be a determination. I have people in my life that are that way, and I know exactly how it works because they always get everything that they shoot for, you know. And so it's wonderful to see that there is an avenue that works that we can count on and call that the axiom, but it's when we embrace it. Well, now here's another part of this thing. what happens when we go through the wrong door. Now, this doesn't just relate to jobs, does it? It can relate to relationships. Is that right, Marie? Well, I'm just checking for sure. Guys, thank you for showing up today. Let me just tell you about the mistakes we make in life. And of course, I can say this because I went through so many doors. Some of them were very hard to back out of. Mostly in the relationship area, you know. But this is before I met Pat. And of course, she straightened it all out for me, but... had more instructions came with it than, you know. But this is an idea that really, I don't think there's an error we can make that we can't turn it into, I'm looking back, it's easier. When you're in the middle of an error, it's not fun. But usually there is something magnificent, if you begin to think this way, that you learn from having gone through the wrong door. I can remember, and thinking of this, a lady who came to me, and it was problems about relationships, but it was the way she described the problem. She said, I know my prince will come, but she said, I don't know whether I'm kissing the wrong frog or kissing the frog wrong. And I thought, do you know, I've had a lot of that same problem. And so, sorry to divide. But think about it for a moment then, that there's no mistake. It's like someone once said, I think it was Robert Schuller, that he wrote a book and it was titled, Failure is Never Final. It's never final. There's really never anything in our life where it seems like we totally messed up that can't be undone, that can't be let go of, because it's just part of life. It's part of what we experience. And I don't know whether we could really, if we haven't made some mistakes, I don't know whether we could really rejoice in the great things that happen to us later, because that's just part of it. There's a story, speaking of open doors and doors closing and doors not opening, that the Apostle Paul, do you remember he went on a missionary journey? He had Barnabas and he had Mark, who was the nephew of Simon Peter, the apostle. And they went through all of what was classified, or as you read history and geography, of Asia Minor. And they did churches like Thessalonica and Derbe and Berea and these churches. And then they decided, and he took on Silas and some other person, but they decided they would go back and visit these churches again a few years later. And so when he got to Troas and he was ready to go into Galatia, well, he said, and he's writing this to the Corinthians, by the way, that the Spirit of God blocked the way. But then he had a dream in the night of a man from Macedonia, which is over into Europe. And so this started a whole new missionary journey, which went through Philippi, Ephesus, and towns like this, Corinth, and finally to Rome, but into all of Europe. But the door now had closed to one direction and to his plan. So what we learn from all of this is we have to be flexible. I think the problem, and think about this problem now, is that when you're knocking on the door, is it that you're not knocking hard enough or that the door is really closed? I mean, that's a little bit of a thing to think about. But on the other hand, when we're into it spiritually, we get guidance, don't we? There's always that guidance if we're just seeking the guidance. And I know that in my life, doors have closed and others have opened. And I've reached a point, like in business, to where, I don't even carry a business card anymore. I don't want any new customers. I've got too many calls coming in already, and too much of everything, it seems like. And so what I'm doing, I'm trying to find a way to stop the flow of everything. I got it started. Now I'm trying to stop it. And I think we can reach that point. Now I'm more concerned about just growing spiritually and expanding that spiritual experience. And so that's the door I'm knocking on, and I think it's the door that most of you are knocking on. But give thought to it now. We are designed in a certain way with certain empowerment. And the one thing that we can be sure of when we look at all of this is that we are strong, powerful people. And here's a statement, and you may not agree with me, but I think if you understand what I'm trying to say, there are no weak people. To appear weak and to be to where you can't manage, do you realize the power it takes to get to that position? It takes a lifetime of really working at it to become weak. Or to appear. There's really no such thing. But to appear weak, you have to work at it really, really hard. You have to use all of the spiritual strength and energy you've got to get to that point. Because really there are no weak people. There are people that have not used their spiritual muscles or developed themselves. Speaking of spiritual muscles, I've got this thing about this church. I love it so much, but it's like going to a spiritual gym, see, and we get to exercise our thoughts in spiritual terms. Do you see? And this is what the prayer is, that we continue to work on this and follow this idea through, that this is how we want it to be. We're going to come here praying. I come here praying for every speaker, even when I've forgotten who it was going to be. Yet I am saying I want to get the message. I want the message to be so blessed that it'll just reach out to everybody. And it doesn't matter who it is. And you know that when you're praying like that, every message comes off good to you. You feel good about every experience. And the mix of spirituality and the friendliness in this place, to me, it's like a spiritual workout. And this is what really that we want to continue on with. This is the idea, because that's the kind of door that I'm knocking on. Thank you.